Senator Singh.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I also rise to contribute to this debate on the Higher Education Research Reform Amendment Bill 2014 and outline clearly why Labor will not vote for this piece of legislation, why we will stand with so many Australians opposed to these measures, not just Australian students but Australian academics, members of the broader community, which clearly have outlined their opposition to the government on these measures because they are, simply put, unfair. They are unfair to future students, they are unfair to Australia's higher education system. And I think Senator Back's done a miraculous job in gilding the lily on the benefits that he's tried to outline of this package on regional Australia. This package does the exact opposite. It actually completely disadvantages regional Australian students when it comes to higher education. And we do have knowledge of that in my home state of Tasmania, which does have campuses in regional parts of the state which are now in jeopardy if this legislation is passed. But really, this package really stands in incredible contrast if we think back to the days of the Whitlam University legacy. Now, I know we're not living in the days of the Whitlam University legacy now, but we certainly haven't moved to the extent away from it to that which is proposed in this package. In fact, it is the policy makers that have put forward this package that lived under that legacy, that had that free education benefit, and that know very well that it was about merit that you went to university, not about how big your or your family's pay packet or bank account was. And that is why the Australian people have very much called this package, this unfair package, the Americanisation of our world-class university system. And that, to me, is exactly what it seems to be, the Americanisation of our system. We know how it works in America. It is very much about the size of how much a family can invest into certain universities to be able to get a seat within them. Whereas here in Australia, we do have, under our, of course, values of egalitarianism, our fair go ethos, we do have a higher education system we can be proud of that is based on equity and merit rather than income. So I think that is a very pertinent way of describing this unfair package. And Australians oppose these things because they understand the value of our universities. They understand the value of our universities not just to perhaps their own themselves or their children or their grandchildren, but they understand them in terms of the research that is provided to our country, to our policymakers, and the broader addition of universities to our communities. Of course, like so many of us, members of our family have a degree. They have a degree that prepared us for highly skilled work. And one thing we know about jobs of the future, we are continually going to need highly skilled work. We value very much, those of us on this side of the chamber, the role, therefore, that universities play, not just in educating individuals, but as contributors to the public good. But in this package, the government proposes, of course, to deregulate university fees, cut course funding by an average of 20%, if not more, and dramatically increase the interest charged on student loans. So while the Education Minister, Christopher Pyne, panders to that politics of envy and in doing so pits pays of tax who were once students against students who pay tax, universities will have to raise their fees to make up for the funding cuts and then raise them again to provide the revenue they deem necessary to keep them competitive. And all the analysis highlights that. All the analysis, whether it's from the Group of 8 or right down to the National Tertiary Education Union, all of that analysis agrees that fees will need to go up by around 30% just to make up for the cuts, just to make up for the dramatic cuts that this government wants to place on our universities. So in total, let's just have a look at those cuts. In total, the Abbott government's budget measures cut $5.8 billion from higher education, teaching and learning and university research. So the negative impact of that cut on funding for Commonwealth-supported places is undisputed. Commonwealth-supported places, of course, incredibly important a part of our university structure. Except, of course, by Christopher Pyne and Joe Hockey. Even the Prime Minister actually finally fessed up in front of the most powerful leaders in the world at the G20 not so long ago, and he said at the G20, "We have tried to deregulate higher education universities," he whinged. And he then went on and said, "And that's going to mean less central government spending and effectively more fees that students will have to pay." He has said it himself. So there is no point in Senator Back trying to gild the lily in saying that this is somehow going to be of benefit to regional students or students anywhere, when it is clear, very clear, from the Prime Minister himself that this is the deregulation of our university system, of our higher education system, and it is going to lead to higher fees for university students. The University of Melbourne Vice-Chancellor Professor Glyn Davis revealed that student fees will have to rise by up to 61%. The University of Tasmania's Vice-Chancellor Peter Rathjen stated that, and I quote, "Those subjects that we do not teach, the research that we do not conduct, or the social programs that we do not support are unlikely to be replaced easily by other providers." And so, for some degrees, that figure, 60%, is incredibly, incredibly high. Not, of course, a problem for students that can afford that, for wealthier students, but a real problem for middle-class people, working people, the bulk of Australian students. For a perfect outcome for a reactionary government that has forgotten its people, because that is clearly what this seems to be, a government that has forgotten its people. A government is supposed to govern for all people, not just those that can afford certain things, not a government that just cherry-picks certain areas, vested interests, one might say, and look after those and leave the rest. But so I don't think they are governing for all people. They don't seem to like certain people because some people to them who feel the economy should be assisting them rather than being slaves to the economy is perhaps how they look at it. But the Swinburne University Vice-Chancellor, Linda Chris-Jansen, dismissed this winner-takes-everything package in a message to Swinburne University staff on the 27th of May. And the Vice-Chancellor said that, and I quote, "Deregulation will inevitably lead to much higher fees for our students. Over time, full fee deregulation will lead to a higher education system characterised by the haves and the have-nots." Well, that puts it pretty clearly as to what I was just saying. The haves, of course, are fine in this education package. The have-nots are not fine. And yes, that's where I do draw back to the Whitlam legacy, because that is where we had our university system opened up to the haves and the have-nots, where for the first time you had families, students go to university where there had never been a student attend university before. And since that time, university has continued to be a part of so many families' lives, with so much pride from those families of being able to have their family member, child perhaps, attend university because of that Whitlam policy change to higher education. Now, it looks like we're going back to those dark old days, just like we're going back to the 1950s on so many policy areas, Mr. Acting Deputy President. such as the Prime Minister's comment about coal being good for humanity. It is a very sad time, I think, in Australia's history right now to see the unwinding of so many good policy decisions and legislation that's been put in place. And I think the higher education system is certainly one of those that occurred starting right back from that Whitlam legacy. I have to say this does seem like a bit of kind of conservative ideology at its best. I think what you could say at top of page one of such an ideology, if there was such a book, would be protect the powerful and the privileged. As long as the haves keep on having through reforms like this, as long as wealth is transferred from the poor to the rich through welfare cuts and tax cuts, as long as the Australian meritocracy is undermined, this government will keep claiming back its black is white, claiming that black is white and that these changes will benefit students from low socio-economic backgrounds because they include the so-called Commonwealth scholarships. Well, let's just have a look at the Commonwealth scholarships. In the real world, how much money is the Commonwealth contributing to these scholarships? Well, absolutely none. How much money is all students contributing to these scholarships? All of them. These aren't Commonwealth scholarships. They are citizens' scholarships. Citizens' scholarships that will underwrite the privilege over the struggling. The elite sandstone universities will charge higher fees so they will have more money in their scholarship funds. Meanwhile, local universities choose between raising fees for all so it can offer scholarships for some, or watching talented students being lured away to those big cities. The talented students themselves face a choice between a lifetime of debt and a lost opportunity. Common sense dictates that the talented students from disadvantaged backgrounds will be deterred from seeking a degree. Now, the fact is, a number of those, of course, will be women. Bank of America Merrill Lynch chief economist Saul Eslake has warned of the consequence of higher interest rates on student loans, particularly for women. Mr. Eslake said the prospect of repaying university loans while raising a family may in fact deter women, while many of other prospective students would weigh up the cost against the benefits. So the Coalition's imposition of a real interest rate on university loans will also deter those who are likely to earn lower graduate salaries. And we know what Christopher Pyne had to say on this matter. He said that women would not be disproportionately better off because that's the only degrees that women attain to. How insulting and how wrong does he have it for so many professional women out there who have degrees in a range of areas? So shutting the door on opportunities for women, putting up the glass ceiling, I think you could say, for another 100 floors or so is no big deal to this government. And this is what Christopher Pyne, the Education Minister, said on that front. And I quote, "Women are well represented among the teaching and nursing students. They will not be able to earn the high incomes that say, dentists or lawyers will earn." That is what your Education Minister said to the Australian people. No wonder this country has turned against this government when you've got outlandish, insulting remarks made by the Education Minister about women, and how wrong he is in saying them as well as that. How out of touch is this Education Minister? And yet he is the one who, through this Parliament, wants to change our university system for men and women for now and so many generations to come. It is a complete wrecking ball that he is driving through our higher education system from a man who is incredibly out of touch, not just with the system itself, but with women on top of that. So let's just have a look at it. If the average Australian wants to be an engineer or a scientist, The professions that will determine Australia's future prosperity are, according to Minister Pyne, those kinds of degrees will not be done by women. According to Universities Australia, the cost of important courses like engineering and science will have to increase by 58% to make up for the cut. Environmental studies will have to increase by 110%. Charles Sturt University Vice-Chancellor Professor Andrew Van has calculated that, and I quote, "For CSU, we calculate this to be an average of 23.5% across the board. Some areas would need to rise substantially. Science fees would need to be increased by 62%, agriculture by 48%, and environmental studies by 114%. So this government should tell the Australian people precisely how much of our future they are willing to burn, because that is exactly what they are doing through this terrible piece of legislation. They should take an explicit policy implementing this funding bonfire to an election and get a clear mandate to try and do it. And I bet you they won't receive it from the Australian people. They have already made it incredibly clear that they do not support these terrible policy to deregulate and drive up the fees of our higher education system. The Coalition does not have a legitimate mandate to implement this university funding dystopia. In fact, as the Education Minister has admitted prior to the last year's election, the government did not have a higher education policy which it was possible to seek a mandate for. It didn't even have a higher education policy. There was no platform upon which the Australian people could judge them on higher education because they simply didn't have a policy. So now, some 1 year later, now in government, to tell the Australian people they're going to drive a wrecking ball through the higher education system and put students in absolute decades upon decades of debt through cutting university funding is, I think, a complete act of deceit to the Australian people. But that is all part of the plan of this government. It's to say one thing before the election, as we know, and then do the complete opposite afterwards. The Minister has cited a speech he gave this February, and he said that comprehensively outlined almost exactly what we did in the budget. That was a very long speech in which the Minister devoted 38 words to a comprehensive outline of his budget plan. In fact, it was a some 6,000 word long speech, and yet 38 words to his budget plan in relation to higher education. How did the Australian public miss this, I wonder? I think because the government certainly did not want to highlight what it was going to do to the higher education system. Well, no one really saw these reforms coming because I think the government didn't want us to see the reforms coming. I think they thought they could get away with us not seeing these reforms coming. But how short-sighted were they? And what a way to treat the Australian community in seeing that they could just sneak this through in the budget and hope that no one was noticing, when in fact what this does is drive such a detrimental change to every student in this country, especially those, as I've highlighted, that simply cannot afford to pay these incredibly erroneous debt degrees that it is placing on so many students. Well, the Australian people will certainly compare this government's performance with those of the Labor Party. The Labor Party stands very clearly for the values of egalitarianism and inclusiveness when it comes to higher education. We value, in fact, the roles very much that universities play, that students play, not just educating themselves, not universities just educating individuals, but as contributors to our public good. That's why we oppose cutting public funding to universities. That is why we will stand for what is fair and decent, and that is for our university system to not be gutted and for our students to have a future in that system.